It's a pleasure being here, and thank you to the Ukrainica Research Institute and the other organizations that have made this possible. It's always a pleasure, and of course, for all of us after a few years not being able to get together or see each other and talk to each other directly, it's a pleasure. There's a war on, and I know that many of us are more involved and interested in what's going on in Ukraine today than we are perhaps in some of the historical issues that I'll be detailing in the next half hour to 40 minutes. But in fact, the war that is being waged against Ukraine and Ukrainians today is at the same time also being waged against us. It's a genocidal war against the Ukrainian state and Ukrainians in Ukraine, and at the same time, it is a war intended to disrupt and dismember the Ukrainian diaspora. And this is what I will be talking about tonight. Now, my involvement with this began in 1985. I was a much younger man then. I had come back to Toronto from the University of Alberta, where I finished my PhD. I had studied Ukrainian refugee immigration to Canada after the Second World War, the so-called DPs. So I was someone who had spent a few years analyzing and thinking about who these Ukrainians were who came to Canada after the Second World War, what their wartime experiences had been, what they had suffered, what they had seen, and why they came to Canada, the United States, England, and so on. I had no idea that when I came back to Toronto in 1985, that I would very soon become embroiled in a very difficult period for the Ukrainian-Canadian community, and indeed the Ukrainian diaspora as a whole, the debate over whether or not there were thousands of Nazi war criminals hiding in our community. And of course, this also involved the Baltic communities. Allegations were made, starting in the mid to late 1970s, that thousands, and I underscore that, of Nazi war criminals were hiding in North America. People who had collaborated with the Nazis, enabled the Holocaust, had participated in pogroms, had denounced neighbors, served as concentration camp guards, and so on. Now, as a young academic, when I heard these stories, these news reports, I was skeptical. I had not uncovered that kind of evidence in my research. Our community was, of course, alarmed. The good name of Ukrainians in Canada, in the United States, in the diaspora more generally, was being called into question. We were being told in the newspapers, on CBC, in the Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, all the major newspapers, New York Times, that we were hiding Nazis in our midst. Now, it's one thing to say, well, some Nazis came to North America after World War II. It's a different thing to say, your community is hiding them. You know they're there, and you're hiding them. So I found myself caught up in this whole subject, and it has continued to this day, and you'll see why in a few moments. So we put on the first slide after this. You'll see how the sort of theme evolves here. So this is a quotation attributed to Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great Russian writer. We know they are lying. They know they are lying. They know we know they are lying. We know they know they are lying, but they are still lying. And this to me is the perfect way to introduce this lecture. They have been lying, and we know they're lying, and they know that we know they're lying, and yet they're still lying. When Vladimir Putin, the KGB man in the Kremlin, announced the special military operation that I've already made reference to, i.e. the war against Ukraine, he said his troops were going into Ukraine to get rid of the Banderivchi. That's exactly what he said. He didn't say Nazis, he said Banderivchi. It's been changed since, but that was the original proclamation. Now, back in 1985, when we got involved in defending the good name of the Ukrainian community against these allegations, we suspected, we always suspected, that the Soviets were behind the problem, that they were creating tensions between Ukrainians and Jewish diaspora in particular, that they were creating discord, that they were trying to get us to fight each other. We always suspected that, but we couldn't prove it. There was a whole barrage of pamphlets and literature and leaflets and propaganda coming out of the Soviet Union that was landing in North America at this time. And some of you will remember some of these little booklets and leaflets that would appear all over the place. Some were distributed by the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians. Some were in bookstores around Toronto. Books like The Truth and Myths About UPA, The SS Werewolves about the Divizia Halachina, We Accuse, This Can't Be Forgiven, Ukrainian People Accused. These were just a few examples of literally dozens of leaflets and booklets that were showing up everywhere. These targeted a very specific community, namely Ukrainians who came to Canada and the United States. We'll just talk about Canada and the United States. After the Second World War, the so-called DPs, victims of the war, political refugees. My parents among them. So I have a personal interest here, there's no doubt about it. My parents were both so-called DPs. These were the targets of this campaign. The Soviets were basically saying that people who came here after the Second World War, that third wave, Trata Khvilya, about 35 to 40,000 people came to Canada. Among them were people who had collaborated with the Nazis, who were Nazi sympathizers, enablers of the Holocaust. So the targets were people like these people shown here at a protest in Munich in 1949. Now, if you look at this slide, let me tell you an interesting story about it. When I was finishing my PhD, and it eventually was published as a book, I was looking for a cover that would be dramatic, that would show Ukrainian refugees protesting. I'd been raised in Kingston, Ontario. My parents were politically active. I grew up in a very small Ukrainian community where there are victims of the Holodomor, where there are slave laborers, where there are veterans of UPA and OUN, Melnikiuchi and Banderivchi. But it was such a small community that we all had to get together and work together. It was remarkable that we actually worked together because there were just so few of us that we couldn't sort of say, to Banderivich, to Melnikiewicz. It didn't make any sense because that would have split the community into two pieces. So we worked together and we had some interwar Ukrainian immigrants there as well. So I grew up in this community thinking, Pravoslavny, Catholic, Banderivich, Melnikiewicz, it's all the same, we're all Ukrainci. That's how I was raised. This is why I got involved in internment and redress and all these other things. Because I wasn't raised to be a Banderivich, I was, but I was also raised to defend Ukrainians, period, right? So I'm looking for a cover of a book called Searching for Place, Ukrainian Displaced Persons, Canada and the Migration of Memory. That's what it's called. And I'm looking everywhere and I'm contacting all my friends. And I'm saying, do you have pictures of Ukrainians in the DP camps, in the refugee camps, showing political activism? And I got dozens of photographs. Here we are at having dinner. Here we are at Cerkva. Here we are at learning a trade. Here we are walking around the parade square of some Freiman Kaserne or something like that. But I couldn't find a political picture. I was shocked. And I'd given up hope. I had given up hope. Until one day, a friend of mine in Calgary, Boris Sador, told me about a friend of his from Manitoba, from Winnipeg, whose father had recently passed. And that father had left his son some small black and white pictures, 2 inches by 1 inch, small little things that could fit in an envelope. And the son said, do you think your friend Lubomyr would like that photograph? I said, Boris said, sure, send him, he'll look at it. So I remember the day I got an envelope from someone I don't know, never met him, Winnipeg, sends it to me. I open the envelope, I pull out the very first picture, and I look at it and I go, ne može bути. Can't believe it. So I immediately sent it to the University of Toronto Press, and they published it as the cover of my book. And the reason it's important is if you look at the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see a man who's sort of looking to you in a light jacket. Then there's a second man, there's a man with a big forehead. And then there's a man walking, you can see the white of his hand and his hair. That's my father. He had no idea his photograph had been taken that day. It just came, to me like that. Sometimes I think there's, greater powers playing fun with me. Anyway, These were the kinds of people that were targeted by the Soviets. Why? Because look at the banners they're carrying. They're talking about Soviet crimes against humanity. They're talking about the Holodomor. They're talking about the Kivnia. They're talking about executions. These were Ukrainian nationalists who were saying to the world, we are witnesses to Soviet atrocities, to the Holodomor, to crimes against humanity. We will tell the world. So these were the natural enemies of the Soviet Union. And of course, there were other formations. It wasn't just the Banderiuchi, the Melnikiuchi, veterans of the Divizia, veterans of UPA. The whole constituency was the enemy in Soviet eyes. Understandably, these were witnesses. So the Soviets wanted to undermine that. And they crafted a campaign known as Operation Payback or Operation Retribution, depending how you translate it, but I like payback. Operation Payback is an actual Soviet KGB document from 1985 that candidly, frankly, openly says that their intention is to provoke discord between Jews and Ukrainians in the diaspora to make sure that those two communities never get together and unite in a common cause against the Soviets. We'll come back to that. Our community, of course, hearing all these rumors, seeing all these stories in the newspapers, reading about it, seeing it on CBC, organized itself. And we organized ourselves as a Civil Liberties Commission, or the Ukrainian-Canadian Civil Liberties Association, under the leadership of this man, who many of you probably still remember, John Gregorovich. His father was the founder of UNO in Canada. His brother, Andrew Gregorovich, passed away not that long ago. John is no longer with us as well. But this was a slightly eccentric man. I have to say that about him. But he took on this role of being the chairman of the Civil Liberties Commission. And for several years thereafter, it was under his leadership that we struggled against the miasma, against the propaganda, the disinformation that the Soviets were putting forward. The Commission of Inquiry established by the Government of Canada was called the Deschênes Commission, after Mr. Justice Jules Deschênes, who was the judge who was appointed to look over this issue. A number of immediate problems arose. At first, the Deschênes Commission said, we are going to go to the Soviet Union to collect evidence. And we said, how could you possibly even consider that, using Soviet evidence? So we began to bombard the federal government with postcards. Now, again, this was my idea. I'm going to take credit for it. This is the very first one. I was driving down the 401. I remember exactly when it happened. And about halfway between Toronto and Kingston, I'd left the CLC meeting, and I thought, Chikai. If you're a Canadian citizen, you could write to your member of parliament or senator for free, as long as you put OHMS on Her Majesty's service. God save the Queen. Right? Or the King now. And so we'd got the idea that we could generate postcards, cheaply printed, like this one, and send thousands of them to the Prime Minister, to the Minister of Justice, whatever. We still do this. It still works. The franking privilege exists. So we began bombarding them, and you can see this one is a protest to Brian Mulroney, who gave us the Deschênes Commission. You know, I'm a conservative, but I'm not happy with this guy. And we said, you can't use Soviet evidence. We challenged that. We also did something that our community hasn't done since, which is we went to the national newspaper record, the Globe and Mail, and we put in advertisements, full-page advertisements, and this is one of two that we ran. Why discriminate? I mean, look at this little girl, you know, and she's saying, why are you discriminating against Ukrainians? And in fact, there were other communities, you can't read it there very well, but the Lithuanian community signed this and others. So we had solidarity with the Baltic communities in particular, and other East European communities. And we basically said, why does the Deschênes Commission have a selective mandate? Because he was only investigating so-called Nazi war criminals in Canada. We said, well, what about communist collaborators? What about Soviet war criminals? Why aren't you looking at any of them? The government never answered that question. But we never forgot it, and you'll see when we get back in a few minutes to what we did about Soviet war criminals in Canada, because there were some. Well, we also generated our own leaflets. We generated our own pamphlets. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see a selection of them. These are things that we did to counter the accusations that there were thousands of Nazi war criminals in Canada. And we distributed these to libraries and to journalists around the country and indeed around the world. For example, On the Record was a collection of letters to the editor that appeared in the Kingston Whig Standard, where there was a very healthy debate. I wasn't really involved in it, but various people in the community debated with the Jewish community about who did what to who in World War II, and how should we get around this issue and what should we do. There was Trial and Error, written by Nikolai Tolstoy, which was a kind of tongue-in-cheek criticism of the Deschênes Commission and of Saul Lippman, who was one of the individuals at that time who used his platform in the Toronto Star to continuously push the line that there were Nazis in Canada, including Joseph Mengele, which proved to be a complete fabrication. In the top corner, you'll see that kind of blue and white one, the memoirs of Bogdan Panchuk. Bogdan Panchuk was a teacher in Montreal after the Second World War, but for the war years and for almost a decade thereafter, he and a group of Ukrainian Canadian veterans stayed in Europe and helped rescue the DPs, including my parents. So he told his story about helping save the Divizia. So this is a man in uniform who served in the Royal Canadian Air Force talking to other Canadians about why he did it. Would a Canadian in uniform in the Second World War save Nazis? Doesn't make any sense, does it? And Panchuk told the truth. He told the truth about the Divizia. And of course, one of my favorites, Stefan Petelitsky. Stefan Petelitsky was a Ukrainian nationalist, a Banderevich, who was captured by the Nazis and ended up in Auschwitz. 154922. I don't even have to look at that to remember the number, right? Stefan Petelitsky tells his story about being a nationalist in the concentration camps. He barely survived. In fact, his body was pulled from a collection of corpses on May 8th, 1945, right? Nashi Veligdin. He says, I was resurrected on Ukrainian Easter. Right? This is a powerful story. This book we distributed internationally. And in fact, I encourage those of you who are teachers, perhaps, to get your students to read it. We have it free of charge on the UCLA website to this day. Anybody can download it whenever they want. So a whole series of booklets and information on Soviet evidence on the Deschênes Commission and so on. Well, eventually, of course, the Deschênes Commission came to the end of its mandate and issued its report. What was fascinating about it, and here's what the report looked like. It says December of 1986, but they never released it until April of 1987. There was some delays, but this is what it looked like. What was fascinating was, after years of being told that there were thousands of Nazi war criminals hiding in North America or in Canada, Justice Deschênes, not Lubomyr Luciuk, Justice Deschênes said this was grossly exaggerated, his words, grossly exaggerated by a factor of no less than 400%. So he dismissed the whole thing as essentially a fabricated hoopla over very little. He exonerated the Divizia. You know, you're going to see in a few moments photographs of the destruction of monuments to the Divizia at Oakville and in Edmonton and so on. People are still spray painting Nazis on these monuments to the Divizia, even though in 1987, Deschênes pointed out that the Divizia Halachina, the Galicia division, could not be indicted as a unit, that there was no evidence to say that it had participated in crimes against humanity or war crimes. He, that is Justice Deschênes, echoed what Panchuk had said in 1945 through the early 50s. He echoed what the British government and the Canadian government looked at in 1950 when veterans from the Divizia were coming to Canada, and the Canadian Jewish Congress properly said, who are these people? Are you sure they're not Nazis? And the government said, nope, they're not. We've investigated this several times. And we did it again with Deschênes. And yet, And yet, we still hear, oh, a whole Ukrainian SS division came to Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom. Why do we not ever hear about Deschênes? In fact, in the book, as some of you will see, we found a document from 1945 where Churchill is discussing the Divizia with Stalin. And Stalin says, I don't care. So if Stalin didn't care in 1945, why are we caring in 1987 or 2022? With the findings released, the Ukrainian community said, we won. Because the government said we would have a made-in-Canada, their phrase, solution to the war crimes problem. If there was evidence against any person that they had participated in a war crime, that person would be brought into a criminal court of justice where the rules of evidence are strict, and if found guilty, would be punished. You are innocent until proven guilty. Pretty fundamental principle. If the evidence is there to convict you of a crime against humanity, a war crime, then you should go into a criminal court. You can defend yourself. The accusations will be made, the evidence will be weighed, and a decision will be made. That was the Made in Canada solution. We went, hurrah. And so did the Jewish Canadian community. I was on CBC with Professor Erwin Kotler, who later became Minister of Justice, and of course, a distinguished parliamentarian, a human rights activist, and we shook hands. We shook hands on CBC. Now, Barbara Frum cut that out, but we actually did. So I wrote about it, and it's in the book. You know, that memory is not going to disappear. It's in the book. That was censored. They didn't want you to see that we could actually agree as reasonable people. So we thought we had, the issue was over because the government would have to lay evidence and then there'd be a trial and a person could defend themselves and so on. Unfortunately, the government was not able to prove in a single case that there was a Nazi war criminal in Canada. And so after several frustrating years from their point of view and from the point of view of those in the Jewish community who advocated that there were thousands hiding here, the government began bending to pressure. And the government of Canada, unfortunately, from my point of view, took the line that they would follow the American pattern. And in the United States, the investigating agency, which was called the Office of Special Investigations, the OSI, didn't try to prove that someone was guilty of a war crime. They said, if you're in the United States and you now affirm that you were in Divizia or in Ulm or Pa, then you must have lied to us when you came here and got your citizenship because we screened everyone perfectly. And if you're here, you shouldn't be here because we were screening people like you out back in 45, 46, 47, 48, 49. So if you're here, you must have lied. So they used the much less rigorous method of saying, we will denaturalize you and deport you if we think you lied about who you were when you came to the United States and therefore obtained your citizenship through misrepresentation. Of course, this caused quite a crisis in the United States. You all remember the name of John Demjanjuk, but there were many others. Right? The OSI rigorously pursued those kinds of people while, frankly, turning a blind eye to people who had served in the Judenrat, who had been in the Jewish community and for whatever reason, out of fear or out of greed or whatever, had served the Nazis. They had a very selective vision of justice, the same way the Deschênes Commission never looked at Soviet war criminals. And yet, despite all that, the government of Canada said, we're going to go the D&D route, denaturalize and deport. Of course, we protested against that and began issuing cards like the next one in relationship to Vasil Lubinsky, who some of you will know, or you will have known him. He's passed away now, where we argued that, and this was a card sent to Prime Minister Chrétien, you know, a federal court found that Vasil Lubinsky is not a Nazi, he is not a war criminal, he's a good Canadian, so why denaturalize and deport him? And this is again one of those On Her Majesty's Service cards. Now again, when we go back, one slide if you go back, you'll see what the Deschênes Commission said. That's him in the bottom. That's Bogdan Panchuk and his wife visiting the Divizia in Rimini. And you can't perhaps read them very easily there, but those are the main findings about the Divizia from the Deschênes Commission. And those are all reproduced in the book. Because again, people say, well, that's not what the Deschênes Commission said. Yes, it is. So because it's not easy to find, it's in the book. So you'll be able to find all of these documents I'm referring to in the book because they're not easily found on their own necessarily, unless you're prepared to spend a lot of time, and we know that most people aren't. So we started to push back. So if we go again now forward with the slides, you'll see the one where we questioned, next slide, D&D, and then the next slide, we began saying, well, wait a minute. Why is it that in Canada we have spent a large amount of time investigating thousands of Nazis in Canada, only to find that, in fact, that was grossly exaggerated? And now you're saying you're not going to accept the position you took in 1987, that we'll take them to criminal courts. You're going to kind of weaken it so that we're going to go into civil proceedings where the rules of evidence aren't as rigidly enforced, and we are going to denaturalize and deport them. Now think about this for just 1 minute before we go into some of this. If some of you may be related to people who survived the Holodomor. If you survived the Holodomor, you weren't from Halachina. You weren't from Bukovina. You're from Velika Ukraina. That's where the Holodomor was. If you were in Canada and you were a survivor of the Holodomor, you were a liar. What do I mean? I mean that when you were asked by Canadian immigration officials who you were, you had told them that you were from Bukovina or Halachina. Because if you said to them, oh, I'm from Soviet Ukraine, I'm a victim of the Holodomor, I'm from Kharkiv, or I'm from Kiev Oblast, and so on, they would have returned you to the Soviets under the terms of the Yalta Agreement. All Soviet citizens, whether they wanted to or not, were forced, obliged to go back to the Soviet Union by the Americans, the French, the British, and even the Canadians. This is a Canadian war crime. Professor Watson Kirkconnell called it that in a letter to Prime Minister Mackenzie King in 1945. You are using Canadian soldiers to push people back across the border, the frontier, to the Soviets who are killing them in many cases. So who were these people that were being sent back? Жертвы Holodomor. Have you ever wondered why there are so few of them? Why many of them were afraid to talk about what they'd survived? We all know this. I mean, Halachina, Bukovina, we're all, nationalist patriots. And you go, why are those people from Velika Ukraina in our community, why are they always so quiet? Why don't they want to talk about it? Now, they've opened up since 1991, that's true. But there were years there where you couldn't get most people who'd survived the Holodomor to talk about it, except among their closest friends. Because they had lied to come to Canada. Was one of the reasons. They would say, we're afraid what will happen to our relatives in Ukraine, right? That was part of that. But there was also that sense that, what if they deport me? Right? And that was a real problem. My godmother was a survivor of the Holodomor. She told me about it, but she didn't go talking about it very publicly. So we pushed back, and we began to find out some very interesting things. I can stand here today and tell you with certainty that there were at least 4. See, not 400, not 4,000, I'm not exaggerating anything. There were at least 4 people that I think should have been investigated for possible collusion in Soviet crimes against humanity and war crimes. I'm not calling them war criminals, let a court decide. I'm not a judge. I'm not a jury. I'm not an executioner. I'd like to be sometimes, but I'm not. We found evidence that there were individuals in Canada who had participated in the execution of prisoners, in torture, who had involved themselves in the agencies of Soviet repression, things like the NKVD, SMERSH, and KGB. 2 of them wrote books in English, published in Montreal in English, in which they bragged about killing Ukrainian nationalists, serving in the Judenrat, collaborating with the Soviet partisans, And in fact, Joseph Rewash there, look at that handsome man. There he is in his NKVD lieutenant's uniform. He published his own picture. And the amazing thing is, Joseph Rewash gave evidence to Justice Deschênes. But he didn't tell him, oh, by the way, I'm very competent to give you evidence because I used to be in the NKVD. In his book, he says he came to Canada, he said he was a chauffeur. So he admits he's a liar. He admits he publishes his picture. And when we said to the government of Canada, how is it that you can't find these people? No answer. To this day, no answer. We found one of them, these are 3 men, we found one woman who was a physician trained in Kiev before the Second World War, or the Great Patriotic War, if you like, who was assigned to SMERSH, Death to Spies, as that's the acronym for it. And her job as a physician, as a doctor, was to go along with the SMERSH execution squad and make sure that everyone they shot was dead. Is that the role of a physician? I thought they're supposed to, heal the injured. Her job was to jump. She said, my job was to jump into the pits and make sure everyone was dead. Oh, you missed one, come back and shoot them. And she was in Montreal, and she was giving an interview to the Montreal Gazette, bragging about her role. Oh, it's too bad I had to do that. Of course, I feel bad about it now, but this was the war, and this was, excuse me. I was with the Immigration and Refugee Board for a couple of years, and I can tell you that that kind of disclosure would have had you deported. We're not supposed to let war criminals into this country, or people who supported execution squads and things, even if you were just a cook or a bottle washer. I'm just the guy that's making lunch for the guys who are shooting people. That's enough to have you excluded from this country, at least in theory. And yet, we had people in this country who were openly admitting and bragging and even advising the government about Nazi war criminals who were themselves, let's say, of dubious background. We even had one guy, and this is the No KGB in Canada. Remember, ladies, no means no. I thought that was a really good slogan, so I used it. No means no to the KGB in Canada. We had one younger man who came to British Columbia, enrolled in a PhD program, very smart guy, in Japanese language and linguistics. No dummy. Who then went to the United States for a holiday, and on his way back, some Canadian official was smart enough to say, well, wait a minute, who are you? What's your record? Did you disclose this? It turned out he'd been in the KGB. He said he was just a translator, but he should have been excluded from this country in the first place. And so we raised this issue. What is this man doing here? And he said, I'm a refugee, right? So he immediately got a hearing before the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada, which said, no, you're not, and excluded him. So you know what he did? He fled to a basement of an East Vancouver church and claimed that he was somehow, a victim, and that he was going to claim sanctuary. Now, I know that if you watch Disney cartoons, you see the Hunchback of Notre Dame, and he's taking Esmeralda and he's bringing her into the Notre Dame Cathedral, and she's got sanctuary. There's no such concept in law, folks. It's a cartoon. And yet, this man was able to stay in that basement for almost 3 years, claiming sanctuary. The Canadian police, the Canadian immigration authorities, would not go into this church and take him out. Now, you might say, well, he shouldn't invade a church. Well, this man had no right to be in Canada. He shouldn't have come to Canada. He had his hearing. He lost his hearing. He was ordered deported, and he played us for suckers. Eventually, they did a deal where his wife and kid could stay, and then he left. Supposedly, he went back to Vladivostok. But we did all sorts of things, like sending postcards like this one, but others which offered him a free one-way ticket. Right? Free one-way ticket. We'll pay to send you home. Go back to Mother Russia. Right? Eventually, he left. Supposedly, he's gone. So Ottawa basically ignored the fact that in this country, there were veterans of the NKVD, SMERSH, and KGB who boasted about what they were, boasted about what they did, but they were never touched. Now, eventually you get tired of always being kind of negative. So we started to do some positive things. And one of the things that we did was we began honoring the heroes of their day. The phrase heroes of their day was first used by Bogdan Panchuk in his memoirs. And we decided that what we would do is we would honor the Canadian, Ukrainian men and women, people like Bogdan Panchuk, Peter Smilsky, Stanley Froelich, Tony Yaramovich, Anne Khrapleva. Some of you will know some of them, Anne Chernianska. These were the men and women who volunteered to serve overseas during the Second World War with the Canadian Forces and Merchant Marine, who served with distinction overseas. Some paid the ultimate sacrifice. They were the ones that created the Ukrainian Canadian Servicemen's Association, the Central Ukrainian Relief Bureau, and for almost a decade, Ukrainian Canadians were overseas after the war helping save the DPs. And we owe them a great debt. So what we did was, it was delayed because of the pandemic, but on the 75th anniversary of VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, we actually installed this window in St. James Church in Paddington, London, England. So that's sort of Kensington, very upmarket area, very fancy area. They had their headquarters in the manse in the parish building beside that church. That's where they curbed, the Ukrainian Canadians had their club, as they called it. We put a plaque there in 1985, and then 2 years ago, we unveiled this marvelous stained glass window of, you know, a trezub and a sonishnik, and the biblical saying at the bottom, I don't know if you can read it, I was a stranger and you gave me shelter. It's beautiful. These Ukrainian Canadians came and defended England, defended democracy against fascism. And then they helped save their brothers and sisters and bring them to Canada, as some of you are doing with our brothers and sisters who are now having to flee Ukraine yet again. The cycle just goes around and around, right? And now we have this spectacular window in that place. And I'll tell you, we couldn't unveil it officially because of COVID, bad timing. I was there in May just of this year and saw it for the first time myself. We're hoping to have a ceremony, an official ceremony in a year or so. But I'll tell you a very interesting thing happened. We were having evensong. We were having an evening prayer with me being present to see the window finally. And just as we were standing around, a group about this size in the parish, you know, it's a very nice Anglican church. There are some spectacular windows there honoring the veterans of the Second World War, honoring the creator of insulin, or the discovery of insulin, Peter Pan's writer, and a whole range of people who were connected to that parish. Anyway, I'm standing there as we're looking at the window, and a young woman and a couple of men with her come through the door. And this is a very popular cathedral for tourists. And I look at her and I go, that's a Ukrainian for sure. And she's looking at the window and she hears someone say something to me and she comes up, what is this? And so I told her the story I just told you. And this was a young Novopribula from the fifth wave who had just arrived in England, had seen the church doors open, had seen people coming and going, went in to take a look around, and she was an artist, and here is this marvelous stained glass window honoring Ukrainian Canadians. And guess what? You know, you can say, well, I'm not religious, or you can say, sorry, Father. You can say, I'm not religious, or you can say, I'm religious, or I don't like church art, or whatever. But this is like a billboard. This is going to be there long after I'm dead, right? And people are going to say, what is this? Why is there a trezub in this Anglican church? What does this mean? And there'll be a plaque at the bottom that explains it. And, you know, we can't get too political with these things, but these are the men and women who saved the Divizia. These are the men and women who saved some of you, or your grandparents, or your parents. I like doing stuff like that. Now, of course, we know, just do the math, there are no Nazis left. So this story has ended. If you were a young man, say 18 years old in 1933 when the Nazis came to power, you'd be 106, 107 now, you'd be dead. If you were a young man 18 years old in 1939 when the war began, you'd be 100. There aren't too many 100-year-olds left. There might be a few. But basically, the Nazis are dead. So the story's over, you'd think. On the flip side of that, though, Soviet war crimes and crimes against humanity were committed until 1991. And so there are many people in the post-Soviet world who were part and parcel of the Soviet system. We know that some of the greatest killers of the Soviet system were never punished. Molotov died in bed peacefully. Kaganovich died in bed peacefully. Betterman, well, he was the leader, he organized the Gulag. They took him out and shot him, but first they gave him an Order of Lenin, and he's been rehabilitated. Even Stalin, as you know, is buried in the Kremlin wall. And when I was there last, I'm now a persona non grata of the Russian Federation, so I guess I'll never be able to visit Lenin again, but Stalin gets red roses in front of his grave every day. Red roses, right? So it tells you something. So there are no Nazis left. There are still some Soviet war criminals kicking around, I'm sure, and of course the KGB man in the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin, is a classic Soviet man. He is my age, roughly. I think he genuinely believes what he says. Because I genuinely believe what I say, just we happen to be on opposite sides of the mirror. And so I don't dispute what he thinks. I challenge it, but I understand where he's coming from. He genuinely believes that. I think he genuinely believes that he was going to denazify Ukraine, get rid of the Banderucci, that he is waging a war against a state that should not exist, that is run by people who shouldn't be running any state, period. As we in the West have dealt with the war, we've also had to deal with another thing. We started with, there are Nazis in Canada and the United States, we should bring them to justice. Then we denaturalize and deport them. By the way, they never deported or denaturalized anybody because the evidence wasn't there. So now we've moved to another stage. The Nazis are all dead, pretty much. We couldn't take them to criminal court, too expensive, too long. Couldn't take them to denaturalize and deportation because it didn't work. So now it's a memory war. Now the war is about not you or your generation or mine, it's about our children. It's about telling our children and our grandchildren that their grandparents or parents collaborated with the Nazis, were Nazis. That we have put up monuments honoring Bandera or Shukhevich or the Divizia. This is because we have a Nazi agenda. And so what we've seen across Canada are a whole series of what I would call hate crimes. In Edmonton, Shukhevich's statue has been spray painted several times. Most recently, actual Nazi. Down there below, 14th Waffen-SS Division, Divizia Halachina, Nazi monument in a cemetery. You understand and I'm sure appreciate there's Future Bakery. Boris Wisniewski put up a poster, Stand with Ukraine, and then they came and they vandalized it. These are probably Russians, excuse the expression, for those of you who are sensitive, they can't spell fuck, or Ukraine, so they misspelled it, so they must be recent arrivals. But this is a kind of a memory war. Now, I'll tell you something very interesting about actual Nazi there. This has happened several times to Roman Shukhevich's statue. So, in consultation with me, the Hromada in Edmonton took my advice. Sometimes people listen to me and put up security cameras. So we have these wonderful images of this man coming because he's a courageous fellow, believes in what he thinks, so he's wearing a mask, of course. He comes at night and he spray paints actual Nazi on it. Now, I don't know if this man is guilty or not because he deserves his day in court, but a man of very similar build and wearing almost the same clothes showed up at the Ukrainian Sum Hall the next morning to take pictures and published a report about this, who knows who did this vandalism, before even the Demilka owners found it. And his name is Duncan Kinney, and he is a well-known left-wing activist, and he's now been charged by the Edmonton police after a year-long investigation. And he's also been charged with the desecration of the monument at the cemetery. Now, again, I don't know if he's innocent, guilty, let a judge decide. But I don't think the police would spend a year investigating this and lay false charges just to sort of shut him up or something. I think this is a pretty clear example of catching the culprit. We've never caught who did it at Oakville, but there are people out there who feel they have the right, because they think that they should be outraged, to come onto your private property and cause damage in the cover of darkness. This is something I think we all need to push back against very firmly. If someone wants to tear down Shukhevich, okay, let's have an argument about it. If someone wants to spray paint the Divizia monuments, fine. But then I can go around and find other monuments that I find offensive. There's one in Earl Bales Park Those of you who live in Toronto, go to Earl Bales Park. There's a Holocaust monument there. I think the front of that Holocaust monument is fine. It's a list of people who suffered the Holocaust. Great. The back of that monument contains text that every one of us should find quite offensive about Ukrainians, about Poles, about Hungarians, about Lithuanians, about Latvians, etc., etc., etc. That text was never authorized. It was put there without permission. And now it's in a public space maintained by your taxes, telling your children and grandchildren that their grandparents were fascists and Nazis and collaborators and so on. That's outrageous. Why is it that the National Holocaust Monument in Ottawa, funded in part by taxpayers, makes not a single reference to the millions of Poles who suffered and died or were enslaved by the Nazis during the Holocaust, much less the millions of Ukrainians or millions of Russians? Let's be fair. Millions of Russians were enslaved or murdered by the Nazis. Millions of Ukrainians were enslaved or murdered by the Nazis. Millions of Poles were enslaved or murdered by the Nazis. And yet there is not a single reference to any of them, but there are references to Afro-Germans. I had to look it up. And I thought I knew something about the Second World War. I had to look it up, and it turns out that there was a small community of Afro-Germans who lived in Germany before the war, and they were rounded up and put in concentration camps, and some of them may have perished, although I wasn't clear on that. But let's say a few hundred were arrested and held under difficult conditions. All right, they should be remembered, I get it. Same thing with the Jehovah's Witnesses, a few thousand. You know, the Roma. There are other communities, there are other victim groups. But why is it that by design they excluded Ukrainians, Poles, and Russians, or try to pretend they're all Soviets? And yet, Jewish victims aren't called Soviet Jews, they're called Jews. Okay, fine. The Nazis clearly targeted the Jews and intended to exterminate them. We all know that. 6 million died. We all know that. But what about the other millions on the National Holocaust Monument that you pay for? It doesn't make any sense to me. Okay, so I started out by saying that there is a genocidal agenda against Ukrainians. Coupled with that, there's an enormous amount of fake news that talks about the Nazis who run the Ukrainian government. Thankfully, we have a president in the person of Volodymyr Zelensky, who is Ukraine's Moses. I say this with great respect. This is a man who has certainly risen to heights I don't think any of us who've met him expected. I certainly didn't. I met him, seemed like a nice guy, but I could not have imagined that he would become the hero he is of Ukraine, of the new modern Ukraine, of Ukraine assuming its rightful place in Europe, which he has done for the country. And yet, the poison of Operation Payback still lingers. It's regurgitated in the media almost constantly. It stokes tensions between Ukrainians and Jews in the diaspora. It plays upon long-standing prejudices and stereotypes on both sides. Let's not kid ourselves. It continues to circulate fake news. And so it weakens our diaspora and what we can do in return for Ukraine. Now, obviously, we all know this. The world today, I think, supports Ukraine and speaks about Ukraine like we've never heard before. Like, my neighbors are Scottish. They've got a Ukrainian flag up. I don't. Shoshadia. What? You know, the world has gone crazy. I'm driving into Toronto today. There's people driving down the Don Valley with Ukrainian flags sticking out of their cars. Now, some of them may be Ukrainian, but I don't think so. I don't think all of them. I'm driving around through Belleville in the county and seeing Ukrainian flags on country farmhouses. Who are all these people who suddenly know that there are things called Ukrainians in the world? Because when I grew up, people said there's no such thing as a Ukrainian. Now, there's too much news about Ukraine. You know, my partner's half Ukrainian. She wants to watch the war news every night. Took one of my maps and spread it out on the dining room table so she can follow the front lines. Sure, what's gone wrong? Well, the world stands with Ukraine. I think that's clear. The civilized world, the free world. There's widespread revulsion against Russian war crimes. You know, people talk about Bucha and Irpin and many other places across Ukraine where they've discovered evidence of war crimes, and all of that has to be documented, of course. But I think really the biggest message I can leave you with is if we look at this next slide, This is the front page of Operation Payback, and it's reproduced in full in the book in English translation. But I've highlighted some of the main points that I really want to emphasize before I conclude. So the Ukrainian KGB, in consultation with the KGB of the USSR, so they're working together in 1985, works to circulate these leaflets and booklets and so on. And all of these materials, second paragraph, compelled the American government to create the Office of Special Investigations at the Department of Justice in order to identify and pursue Nazi criminals. And that allowed us to shape US public opinion. That's what it's all about. It's not about really convincing you so much that your grandfather or father may have done something bad or anything like that. It's about convincing your neighbors that they shouldn't support you when you say, hey, stand with Ukraine. They'll say, well, yeah, but you know, you've got this bad past. Considering the positive evolution, third paragraph, of Operation Payback in the United States, in 1980-85, measures aimed at unfolding a similar campaign in Canada were implemented. And we suspected it, as I said at the beginning, we suspected this was what was happening, but we had no way of proving it. And that forced the government of Canada to establish in February of this year a commission headed by the lawyer, actually Judge Deschamps. So this is them, the Soviets, the KGB, bragging, telling us what we always suspected, but what they, clearly did. Now, how do we get past this? Can we get past this? People have heard me give this kind of talk and they go, so, right, what's the prescription? How do we cure this? I have to say, I've thought about that long and hard, and I don't think we're going to. I honestly have to be a bit of a bearer of bad tidings in a way. The poison that the KGB inserted into the body politique of North America has had consequences now for half a century. Ask your neighbor tomorrow or next day, do you think that there were Nazis in Canada after the Second World War that maybe hid in the Ukrainian community? I bet you every one of you will get a yes, right? People who know me stay away from me if I come near them and try to ask them that question, but because they know I'll start jumping on them. But the reality of it is, most of our fellow Canadians would say yes. And they might say, but that's in the past, it's all gone, we're standing with Ukraine and all that, but there's that lingering doubt. So the Soviets, give them credit. My afterword in the book is called, Give the Devil His Due. They were brilliant. They were brilliant. They took these long-standing prejudices and stereotypes, they stoked them, they disrupted the beginnings of what was going to be some collaboration between Jews and Ukrainians in the diaspora around human rights issues, the dissidents and so on, the refuseniks. People were starting to work together in Ukraine and here, and the Soviets were alarmed about that, and so they used the World War II war crimes thing to break us up. And you don't have to believe Lubomyr Luciuk, because we got it in writing. So, what we suspected turned out to be true. And the only thing, although I don't think this will change in my lifetime for whatever time I still have left on earth, I'm not sure it'll change in the time, that God grants my daughter on earth. The poison was planted pretty deep. But the only thing we can try to do is what the good book tells us to do. And that is, when you think back to it, to John, the truth will set us free. So I hope with this book, I've given you the truth. Thank you very much.